I would like you to construct a table that comprises 4 columns. For the first column, I would like you to list behaviours that you feel might be suitable in some circumstances, but not other circumstances. For example, worrying about problems in your life might be suitable in some circumstances, such as when you're alone on a Sunday afternoon, but not in other circumstances, such as during an exam or while attempting to sleep. Likewise, asserting your concerns is suitable in some circumstances, such as when you're a manager, but not in other circumstances, such as when you need to impress a manager. Next, alongside each of these behaviours, I'd like you to specify the circumstances in which this behaviour is suitable in the second column, and the circumstances in which this behaviour is unsuitable in the third column. Now, the circumstances in which the behaviour is suitable is called the SD, which strangely enough stands for discriminative stimulus. The circumstances in which the behaviour is unsuitable are called the S delta, or sometimes the discriminative stimulus for extinction. And this triangle, besides being a triangle, is the Greek letter delta. Finally, for each behaviour, I want you to specify the reward you might dispense to someone or to yourself whenever the behaviour is initiated in the right circumstance. Now, perhaps stop this recording for a few minutes to complete this task. Now, this task was designed to introduce you to the concept of discrimination training. Now, discrimination training sounds like I'm going to teach you how to be racist, but actually, discrimination training ensures that people learn to initiate behaviours in the right circumstances rather than all circumstances. So let me provide a few examples. Discrimination training was originally examined in animals such as pigeons. Now, pigeons often peck at the ground, usually to seek food. Now, in one study, if a yellow light was turned on, the pigeons would receive a reward, such as food, whenever they pecked the ground. If a blue light was turned on, the pigeons would not receive the food when they pecked the ground. Now, over time, the pigeons learned to peck the ground only if the yellow light was turned on. Now, in this instance, the yellow light is called the SD, or discriminative stimulus. That is, the circumstances in which the behaviour is reinforced or rewarded. The blue light is called the S delta, or discriminative stimulus for extinction, the circumstances in which the behaviour is not reinforced or rewarded. Nevertheless, unless your aim in life is to become the supreme leader of pigeons, this example is probably not especially useful. So let me provide 2 more relevant examples. Suppose a teacher asks a student to spell some word. If the student answers Tree, this student will be rewarded provided the question was spelled tree, but not if the question was to spell something else. So what is the behaviour, the reward, the SD or discriminative stimulus, and the S delta in this example? Well, in this example, the behaviour is the answer Tree. And the reward is probably the approval or praise of the teacher. Whereas the SD or discriminative stimulus is the question, please spell the word tree, because the behaviour Tree will be rewarded or reinforced in this circumstance. Whereas the S delta is the question, please spell some other word like flower, because the behaviour Tree will not be rewarded or reinforced in this circumstance. And this example shows how teaching many skills, such as spelling, is actually similar to the discrimination training observed in pigeons, in which the answers are reinforced only when the students follow the right questions. The final example is more interesting. This example revolves around a psychological technique called stimulus control of worry. In particular, people often worry or ruminate excessively about their problems. One worry, such as, I might not pass this exam, will often elicit another worry, such as, I might fail the course, or my life might be a disaster. And these cycles of worries can evoke severe anxiety and culminate in depression. Now, attempts to overcome these worries are often not especially helpful. If people strive to suppress or distract themselves from their worries, these worries often intensify. That is, thoughts that people attempt to avoid often become more prominent in their minds later for a variety of reasons. So instead, another strategy is needed to prevent this escalation of worries. Now, one technique is called stimulus control of worry. In essence, people form the intention to worry only at a specific time of the week. They might, for example, decide to delay their worries until Sunday from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. And this technique, although seemingly unusual, is actually quite effective. Over time, people learn to worry only during the designated time. And overall, they worry less often and can control their worries more effectively. So what is the behaviour, the reward, the SD or discriminative stimulus, and the S delta in this example? Well, the behaviour is obviously the act of worrying about some problem, such as an upcoming exam. The reward is not as obvious, but maybe something like feelings of pride or self-acceptance. That is, the person feels self-acceptance rather than self-loathing when they worry at the right time. Now, the SD or discriminative stimulus is Sunday between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m, the time during which the behaviour of worrying is rewarded. The S delta is every other time, the times during which the behaviour or worrying is not rewarded and may even be punished. Nevertheless, discrimination training, although often ineffective, can elicit some problems. Specifically, discrimination training might elicit disappointment and other negative emotions. So, for example, let us return to the example that revolved around the pigeons. Remember that if the yellow light was turned on, the pigeons received a reward, such as food, whenever they pecked the ground. If the blue light was turned on, the pigeons would not receive the food if they pecked the ground. Now, suppose that during the first few trials, the yellow light was on, the pigeon pecked the ground, and thus received the reward of food. Now, when the blue light is turned on, the pigeons are likely to expect a reward after pecking the ground. After all, the pigeons had previously received a reward in response to pecking when a light was turned on. So, when no food is offered, the pigeons are likely to feel frustrated or dejected in some way. They're likely to experience all the problems that extinction tends to evoke, such as aggression, and these problems might cause other issues. So one approach, called Errorless Training, tends to circumvent this problem. In essence, the S delta is extremely faint initially and then gradually becomes more intense over time. So to illustrate, in the previous example, the blue light might be very faint, and consequently, the pigeon will hardly notice the blue light and therefore is not as likely to peck in response to this light. So the pigeon will seldom peck and thus will seldom feel disappointed when no light or food arrives. Then over time, the blue light becomes gradually more intense. However, because the intensity rises only gradually, the pigeon hardly notices this change. So again, the pigeon will seldom peck and thus will not often feel disappointed when no food arrives. So eventually, even when the blue light is completely on, the pigeon might still never peck. Therefore, ultimately, the pigeon learned to peck in response to the yellow light, but not in response to the blue light, without ever experiencing the disappointment of pecking when the light was blue and receiving no food. That is, the pigeon never pecked at the wrong time, and hence the technique is called Errorless Training. Now, errorless training can also be used to train people. So to illustrate, students might receive a question with very strong hints. For example, they might receive the question, what is 7 minus 3? With 4, the answer, written faintly but legibly after the equal sign. Over time, the teacher might present the question again, but the answer might be increasingly faint or only include, say, parts of the number 4. Eventually, the teacher might present the questions again, but with no clue. Now, this scenario is actually an example of errorless training. To demonstrate, suppose the behaviour is the answer 5, and the reward is approval from the teacher. The SD or discriminative stimulus is a question in which the answer 5 is rewarded, such as what is 3 plus 2? The S delta is a question in which the answer is something else like 4, such as what is 7 minus 3? So if the teacher provides some clues to the S delta, such as a faint number 4 after the question what is 7 minus 3, the student will never demonstrate the behaviour of 5 to the S delta. That is, the student will not provide the answer 5 when the answer is actually 4. So the student will answer correctly and therefore will not be disappointed after answering incorrectly and receiving no reward. Hence, this example, although seemingly different to the illustration with pigeons, actually still demonstrates errorless training. Now, as these examples show, errorless training can prevent unpleasant experiences for the animal, student, child, and so forth. But errorless training does generate some problems. In particular, when errorless training is utilised to develop some skill, the individual or animal is not as flexible. That is, their behaviour isn't as likely to adapt to changing circumstances. So to illustrate, let's return to the previous example in which errorless training was utilised to teach the pigeon to peck in response to yellow lights, but not blue lights. Now, because the blue light was introduced very gradually, the pigeon really never pecked in response to the blue light. And so the pigeon never really learned that pecking in response to a blue light will not attract rewards. The pigeon never learned to inhibit the inclination to peck and thus control its behaviour in response to blue lights. It basically just didn't notice the blue lights. So what is the implication of this observation? Well, suppose now the researcher changed the schedule of rewards. That is, suppose pigeons are now rewarded if they peck in response to blue lights, but not yellow lights. Unfortunately, the pigeon, because of its inability to control its behaviour, cannot adapt effectively. That is, the pigeon will not learn as quickly to peck in response to the blue light. The pigeon will tend to ignore the blue light. And so the behaviour of this pigeon will thus seem inflexible and rigid.